I still remember the way the sun hit the parade ground that morning at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. The brass band was tuning up, and the rows of seats were filled with family members dressed like it was Sunday service. The air smelled like pressed uniforms, sea salt, and hot pavement. I sat in the farthest chair of the family section, my back straight, my hands folded my service dress blues, sharp as if I were back at inspection. To my left, my stepfather Douglas leaned back with a smirk that had not changed in 30 years. He whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "At least your brother actually served." My stepmother Linda let out a short laugh and added, "Thank God we have him." Their words slid across the back of my neck like a cold blade. My stepbrother Evan stood at the front in his freshly issued uniform waiting to receive his trident. The crowd's pride radiated toward him like heat. I could feel it even from my seat at the edge. Every camera pointed at him. Every whispered congratulations carried his name. Mine floated in the background like a shadow. I kept my breathing even. I had practiced this for years. Let them underestimate you. Let them think they have already written the story. I had sat through their dismissive comments for decades. Today was supposed to be his day, not mine. I had told myself that over and over as the orders came down and the invitation from my family arrived, the first one in years. But as the ceremony began, I realized they had not changed at all. I was still the girl at the edge of the table. The master of ceremonies called out names. One by one, the candidates received their pins. When Evan's name echoed through the speakers, the Whitlocks erupted in applause. Douglas clapped loud enough to make people turn. Linda dabbed the corner of her eyes like she was the mother of a national hero. I remained still, hands on my lap, my posture, the only armor I needed. I knew who I was. Vice Admiral Sloan Archer, Pacific Fleet Logistics Command, 30 years in the Navy, countless operations, every stripe earned, not handed, yet to them I was invisible. Then the commanding officer, a 3-star general, stepped up to the podium. The crowd settled. His voice carried across the courtyard with that unmistakable authority that only decades of command can shape. As he began to speak, he scanned the audience, a habit old commanders keep. His eyes landed on me. I saw the recognition spark in his expression. His voice faltered for half a second, just long enough for Douglas to glance toward the stage, confused. The general paused, then stepped away from the microphone and walked down the steps toward the crowd. The families whispered as he passed. Evan straightened instinctively. The general stopped right in front of me. For the first time that morning, the air around the family section shifted. He drew himself up to full height. The sun hit the stars on his shoulders. His hand came up in a crisp salute. "Vice Admiral Archer," he said. "It's an honor, ma'am." The sound of it split the air. Conversations stopped. 100 heads turned toward the edge of the seating area. Every camera that had pointed at Evan swung in my direction. For a moment, even the band seemed to hold its breath. I rose slowly and returned the salute steady, precise, the way 3 decades of discipline teach you. I did not smile. I did not need to. The general's salute was louder than any applause. Douglas stared at me, his mouth open, but no sound coming out. Linda blinked like she had just seen a ghost. Evan's hand twitched at his side. The man they had mocked for years stood in uniform, saluted by a general recognized in front of every proud parent in the crowd. It was not revenge spoken out loud. It was truth laid bare in daylight. Whispers spread like wind across the courtyard. I heard someone say, "Vice Admiral." Another asked, "What the hell?" Someone else whispered Pacific Fleet. My family sat frozen while strangers looked at me with respect they had never shown. For 30 years, they had treated me like a background note. Now I was the headline. I held the salute a second longer before lowering my hand. The general nodded once sharp and returned to the podium. My stepfather looked like the ground had opened under his chair. My stepmother could not meet my eyes. For the first time in my life, I did not feel small in their presence. I felt like the weight had shifted, like the years of silence had finally spoken for themselves. Have you ever been mocked by your own family only to prove them wrong in front of everyone? Tell me where you are watching from. When I think of Virginia Beach in the 90s, I don't see the ocean or the summer boardwalk like other people do. I see the kitchen table. I see the uneven light of the old chandelier hitting Douglas Whitlock's face as he sat at the head of the table like a judge. I see my mother Margaret moving around him quietly like she was always walking on a glass floor. And I see my own chair at the far end, smaller, lower, easy to ignore. I was 10 when my mother remarried. I remember the ceremony not because it was beautiful, but because Douglas didn't look at me once. He looked at her, he looked at the guests, but to him, I was the extra piece of furniture that happened to be there. When Evan was born, the house turned into a shrine for him. He cried and they ran. He smiled and they clapped. His pictures filled the walls. Mine stayed in a shoebox on a shelf. Douglas liked to call him the legacy, even when he was still in diapers. He said it like he was announcing a family title. Whenever relatives came by, he would lift Evan in the air and say, "He's going to carry the Whitlock name." I stood in the corner holding my own glass of juice like a stranger at my own family's gathering. As Evan grew, the rules shifted around him. Dinner started when he was ready. The nicest chair belonged to him. The biggest slice of pie was his. I learned to eat fast and quiet because Douglas hated noise. He would look down the table and remind me, "Don't talk with your mouth full, girl." My name wasn't Sloane in his mouth. It was Girl. My mother rarely said anything. She told me once he just wants order in the house. Order felt a lot like erasure. By the time I was in high school, I had already learned the patterns. He sat at the head. Evan sat on his right. Linda, his second wife after my mom died, would one day sit on his left. My spot was always at the corner. When teachers sent home letters about my grades, he didn't even read them. But when Evan came home with a simple participation ribbon, Douglas gathered the neighbors to brag. "That boy is going to be something great," he'd say. Then he'd turn to me with that half smile. "You'll figure something out, too." When I told him I wanted to join ROTC, his face hardened the way it did when he talked to the dog for chewing the newspaper. "ROTC is for real soldiers," he said, "not for girls who don't know what discipline is." I had the grades. I had the interest. What I didn't have was his approval, and in that house approval was oxygen. My mother tried to talk to him once. He cut her off with one sentence. She fell silent. I never brought it up again, but I didn't forget. The small cruelties were daily. He would praise Evan for finishing his cereal like he had climbed Everest. He would call me lazy if I left a plate in the sink. He always sat in the living room after dinner with Evan on his lap watching old war movies talking about how men built the world. I sat in my room with the door closed, pressing my earphones in deeper, imagining a place where my name actually meant something. I learned how to disappear in plain sight. I learned to move through that house without making sound. I learned the weight of my own silence. People think the worst hurts come from big moments, but it's the slow drip that empties you out. When he called Evan the legacy for the 100th time, I started to believe it. I wasn't a legacy. I was the leftover, the extra, the girl at the end of the table. When my mother passed away a few years later, he didn't hug me. He didn't even say anything personal. He just told me to keep the house clean because Evan needed a stable home. I was 16, and I realized in that moment that nothing I did would ever be enough for him. That understanding sat in my chest like a stone. It grew heavier every year. It was the weight I carried into adulthood, the one thing I could never set down. I started running early in the mornings before school. At first, it was just to get out of the house, but then it became the only place where my lungs felt full. I imagined myself in a uniform. I imagined my name being called. I imagined a place where no one could talk over me, where my worth was measured by what I did not, by who someone else thought I was. I kept those dreams quiet. Douglas had a way of killing hope with a single sentence. Every time he said the words, "real soldier," every time he patted Evan's head and ignored me, a small piece of resolve formed under the surface. It wasn't loud. It wasn't fiery. It was quiet and hard and steady, like steel forged in a dark corner. I didn't know then that this steel would one day carry me further than his words could ever reach. All I knew was that in that house, I would never be enough. So I decided slowly, silently, that I would build a life where his voice didn't matter. I didn't tell him. I didn't tell anyone. I just held on to that thought like a secret weapon. I was 18 when I mailed the application to the Naval Academy without telling Douglas. I filled it out at the kitchen table late at night after everyone had gone to sleep, the same table where I had spent years being reminded that I was the extra. I remember staring at the last line, the place where I signed my name, and thinking that if he found out, he would tear this dream apart, like he had torn every other small thing that mattered to me. I sent it anyway. The letter of acceptance arrived 3 months later. He read the envelope once and said nothing. My stepmother Linda told me quietly that I should reconsider. "It's too hard for a girl," she said. I packed my bag anyway. On induction day at Annapolis, I stepped through the gates alone. All around me, families hugged their children, fathers clasped their sons' shoulders, mothers wiped tears from their eyes. I had no one to hug. I had no one to wave to. I carried one duffel bag and a single piece of paper with reporting instructions. The air smelled like fresh paint starch and fear. A plebe summer detailer barked my name and pointed me toward my company. I answered loud and clear. The sound of my own voice surprised me. It sounded solid, like it had weight for the first time. The first weeks were a blur of early mornings, shouted commands, aching muscles, and the constant need to prove that I belonged there. Out of 40 people in my company, only 4 were women. Every run, every inspection, every test felt like a silent question aimed at me. Can she keep up? Can she last? Some of the guys didn't bother hiding their doubts. They called me Archer when they were being formal and Girl when they weren't. I learned to tune them out the way I had learned to tune out Douglas. Words didn't break me anymore. The nights were the hardest. The academy quieted down after lights out, but the weight of the day pressed into my bones. I lay in the narrow rack staring at the ceiling, hearing Douglas's voice in my head as clearly as if he were standing beside me. "You'll quit! You're not built for this. You'll come crawling home." Those words burned hotter than the blisters on my feet. They kept me awake, then they got me out of bed before reveille. I ran harder because of them. I pushed through because of them. I was not going to give him the satisfaction of being right. I learned the rhythm of military life the way some people learn a song. Chow. Formation. PT. Classes. Drill. Inspections. Lights out. Repeat. My hands grew calloused from rifle drills. My boots molded to my feet. My shoulders squared without me noticing. I learned to salute with precision, to stand still even when sweat burned my eyes, to think 3 steps ahead. When other plebes grumbled about the cold or the early mornings, I didn't. I had been living in cold silence for years. This was just a different kind of weather. There were moments when it almost broke me. One night, after a particularly brutal physical test, I sat on the steps outside Bancroft Hall, hands shaking from exhaustion, the rain soaking my uniform. A classmate passed by and muttered, "She won't last." He didn't even mean it cruelly. It was just a fact to him. A girl like me didn't belong here. I watched him walk away and felt something settle in my chest. Not a scream, not a fire, a quiet vow. I would last. I would outlast them all. Academics were no easier. I came in strong, but the workload crushed even the best students. Engineering, navigation, physics, leadership. Every page of my textbooks felt like a wall I had to climb. Some nights I studied until my vision blurred. Other nights I fell asleep at the desk. But slowly, the grades came back and the marks rose. I earned respect, not with loud words, but with relentless consistency. One instructor told me, "You don't talk much, Archer, but you deliver." It was the first compliment I remembered receiving from an adult in years. I carried it like a small, steady flame. During the first summer cruise, I stood on the deck of a destroyer watching the Atlantic stretch endlessly in every direction. The ship cut through the water like it belonged there. I felt something shift inside me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't standing at the edge of someone else's story. I was at the center of my own. No Douglas, no smirk, no girl at the corner. Just my name, my uniform, my hands gripping the rail as the wind hit my face. Still, every promotion during those 4 years felt like a secret I was keeping. I didn't call home. I didn't write. I knew what Douglas would say. He'd remind me that it was temporary, that I'd break eventually. So I let the distance grow like a wall. Each mile between Virginia Beach and Annapolis was another layer of armor. By the time I reached my senior year, I had become someone even I barely recognized. My posture was straighter, my voice was firmer, my silence was no longer weakness. It was a weapon. On graduation day, the parade field shimmered under the summer sun. Families filled the stands, waving flags and shouting names. I stood in formation, my sword at my side, my cover pristine, the weight of 4 years balanced on my shoulders. When my name was called, I marched forward with every step measured. There was no one in the crowd for me. No proud parent, no clapping hands. But when the superintendent handed me my commission, the applause from strangers filled the air. I looked at the flag whipping in the wind and whispered to myself, "You made it. Not because someone believed in you, because you refused to break." That night, when I packed my gear to leave the academy, I sat on my rack one last time and let the silence settle around me. I thought of Douglas. I thought of the kitchen table. I thought of the way he said I wouldn't last. And then I realized something that felt almost like laughter rising in my chest. He was wrong. I had lasted. And this was only the beginning. Coming home always felt like stepping back into a story I was never meant to belong to. Every time my boots hit the familiar pavement of Virginia Beach, I could already hear Douglas's voice before I even opened the door. The house smelled the same, like polished wood, and something faintly sour, and it always felt too quiet when I entered, as if the walls themselves were waiting for the next insult. He'd be sitting in his usual chair in the living room, his beer balanced on the armrest, the TV tuned to some sports channel he never fully watched. And then, like clockwork, he'd glance up at my uniform and say it with that dry little laugh. "Paper pusher." Sometimes he added, "You're not real Navy." Other times he didn't need to. The way he said my name carried all the contempt he couldn't be bothered to articulate. My mother Margaret before she died, and later Linda, always stood to the side pretending the tension wasn't thick enough to choke on. She'd fuss over the dinner table or pour drinks or try to change the subject. Keep the peace, that's what she called it. Peace meant me swallowing his words like they didn't cut. Peace meant nodding politely while he congratulated himself for a son he barely had to raise. Evan was always the center of everything. Even when he wasn't in the room, he filled the air. The first time I came home from the academy on leave, I still half believed I could show them who I was becoming. I wore my uniform sharp and clean. I walked through the door standing straight ready to prove something, but Douglas just looked me up and down and said, "So you're still at that school playing dress-up?" My mother told him to be nice, but she said it with the softness of someone who didn't really believe she could change anything. I sat at that table and listened as they talked about Evan's soccer games, his grades, his summer camps. I wasn't really there. I was a placeholder. As the years went by and my rank began to climb, the visits didn't change. I got better at hiding it, at building a mask that nothing could crack, but his words never softened. When I earned my commission and came home in uniform, he didn't say congratulations. He poured himself another drink and said, "Real sailors don't sit at desks." When I told him about my assignment to a destroyer, he just shrugged. When I told him about deployments, he said nothing at all. It wasn't that he didn't care. It was that he cared about Evan more. Evan grew into the golden boy everyone expected him to be. By the time he was in high school, he had an easy smile, a strong arm for football, and the kind of charm that made adults forgive him before he even did anything wrong. Douglas beamed at him in a way he had never once looked at me. Evan didn't ask for that pedestal, but he never stepped off it either. I learned to exist in the shadows of his applause. Every time I came home on leave, there was some new achievement of his plastered on the wall. Photos of games, trophies, medals, all displayed in the living room like a shrine. One Thanksgiving, I tried to talk about the deployment I had just returned from. I was still shaking off the salt air and the rhythm of the ship. Before I could finish describing a single thing, Douglas cut me off with a laugh. "Don't bore us with your paperwork, Archer. Evan, tell them about the touchdown you made." The table erupted in excitement. My story vanished into smoke. I sat there, hands wrapped around a lukewarm glass of water, and listened to them celebrate him. That was the rhythm of this house. My silence, his glory. When Margaret passed away, Linda stepped into the same role without missing a beat. She was even quieter, even more careful to keep Douglas's moods smooth. If I came home tired from a deployment, she'd offer pie, but not protection. If he called me a paper pusher, she'd smile weakly and say, "Don't take it so seriously." He's just teasing. Except it was never teasing. Teasing ends. This was permanent. The older I got, the less I tried to fight it. My visits became shorter. I spent more time in hotel rooms than in the house. I told myself it was because of logistics. In reality, it was because I didn't want to breathe the air of that living room anymore. I didn't want to sit at that table and pretend their ignorance didn't cut through me like glass. He never hit me. He never shouted. He didn't need to. The way he dismissed everything, I was made it clear where I stood. When I made Lieutenant Commander ahead of schedule, I didn't even call home. A week later, when he found out through Evan, Douglas called me and said, "So you got promoted." "That's good. Logistics must be easy if they give stripes out that fast." I held the phone, stared at the wall of my barracks, and said nothing. Silence was the only language he understood, and even then he thought he'd won. I learned to compartmentalize. The Navy became my real home. The deck plates, the command centers, the smell of jet fuel and salt water, the sound of orders being carried out with precision. That world made sense. Douglas's world was a cage I visited out of obligation. It didn't define me. But the voice he planted never really left. Even on deployment, even during moments of success, I'd hear him. Paper pusher? Not real Navy. It was the echo of every time I was told I wasn't enough. The last time I saw him before my assignment to Pearl Harbor Naval Base, I wore my khakis, my hair pulled tight, my ribbons exactly where they belonged. He didn't even look at them. He sat in his chair, swirling his drink, and said, "Good. Stay there." The way he said it wasn't approval. It was dismissal, like I was finally out of the way. I drove back to base that night with the windows down, letting the air bite at my face, and told myself I wouldn't come back again. But his voice came with me. Not because I wanted it, because every insult he'd thrown at me had built a wall inside my head, and even at my highest points, it whispered. Years later, even in command, even with stars on my collar, sometimes I'd hear him in the quiet after a long day. Paper pusher. Not real Navy. I learned to keep working anyway, because the only way to silence a voice like that isn't to argue. It's to rise so high it has no place left to follow. My career did not rise like a rocket. It climbed like a mountain, one uneven step at a time through sand, sweat, and silence. My first assignment as an ensign placed me in Norfolk a junior officer with a crisp uniform and a heart that beat too fast every time I stepped onto the deck. I learned quickly that logistics isn't glamorous. It doesn't make headlines. It doesn't earn applause at the dinner table, but it keeps everything moving. Fuel lines, flight decks, supply chains that stretched across continents. Everything depended on work. No one outside the service ever noticed. I worked longer hours than anyone else because I couldn't afford to give them a reason to doubt me. Those first years were hard in a way that burned discipline into my bones. Every time I stepped into a room full of senior officers, I felt their eyes pause for just a second too long. The young woman in logistics. The one they weren't sure would last. I responded by being flawless. My reports were airtight. My inspections passed with 0 errors. I learned every regulation until I could recite it under my breath at night. Slowly, doubt turned into acknowledgement, and acknowledgement turned into trust. I pinned on lieutenant, then lieutenant commander. Each pin felt less like a medal and more like a stone I was stacking beneath my feet to climb out of the shadow Douglas had built. Bahrain came next. Hot winds, sand that stung my face, convoys running day and night. Operations in the Middle East stretched everyone thin. I spent months managing supply lines that moved like veins under the skin of the fleet. When ships left port, my work was invisible. But when they came back, fueled, armed, and ready, I was the reason they could keep moving. I remember standing on the pier at midnight, the heat still clinging to the air, looking at the glow of the ships on the horizon. No one applauded. No one saluted me. But they moved because of me. That was enough. As the years passed, I climbed the ranks with a steady, relentless rhythm. Commander. Captain. I took commands most people avoided. I volunteered for the assignments no one wanted. Long deployments, crisis zones, nights where the phone never stopped ringing. I learned to lead without needing anyone to clap. I learned to command in a way that left no doubt. By the time I stood on the bridge of a logistics command ship as captain, I had become the kind of officer I used to imagine in the dark when Douglas's voice tried to bury me. The Pacific brought a new chapter, Pearl Harbor, blue water stretching beyond the horizon. Operations in the South China Sea tested every part of our network. We worked under pressure that could break steel. Typhoons, tense standoffs, fleets depending on us to make sure fuel and ammunition arrived when they needed it most. The world never saw those moments, but history bends on quiet logistics. I spent nights watching radar screens, coordinating convoys, rerouting assets, knowing that one mistake could leave ships stranded. I carried that responsibility without flinching. I became known for precision and for the silence of things that work. When the Bronze Star came, it wasn't at a ceremony filled with cameras. It was handed to me quietly in a room with 3 other officers who had done the work no one outside would ever understand. I tucked the medal into my bag and went back to my office. I didn't call Douglas. I didn't tell Linda. I didn't even tell Evan. The medal didn't change what I already knew. His approval was a currency I would never hold. Promotion to Rear Admiral came with more ceremony. Flags, salutes, speeches about service and sacrifice. I smiled, for the photos shook hands with people I respected, and then went back to work. The higher I climbed, the more I learned to measure my worth in quiet results. My command expanded across fleets. I learned how to move entire task forces with precision. I became a name people recognized not because of theatrics, but because when I said something would happen, it did. But no matter how many stars appeared on my collar, Douglas never called. Not once. When Evan graduated college, he sent out invitations to the entire family. When I got my first star, silence. When I got my second, more silence. It was almost funny. The world saw a Vice Admiral in the making. He still saw a girl at the end of a table. The day I pinned on Vice Admiral was not grand in my memory because of the speeches. It was because of the quiet after. I stood alone in my office after the ceremony, still in uniform, the weight of the 3rd star settling on my shoulders. People had shaken my hand all day. The secretary had spoken. Sailors had saluted. And when it was done, I pulled out my phone, stared at the blank screen, and knew there would be no message from him. Not even a word. That night, I walked out to the pier in Pearl Harbor. The air was still warm. The ships rested like sleeping giants. I thought about the girl who used to stand at the end of the table in Virginia Beach, about the insults that became echoes in my head. Paper pusher. Not real Navy. I thought about every time I had swallowed his silence and turned it into fuel. 30 years. 3 stars. A life built not from his belief, but from his absence. Climbing the ranks was never about proving him wrong. Not really. It started that way, but somewhere along the endless nights and deployments, it became something else. It became mine. My mountain. My climb. My name. And even if he never called, never acknowledged, never understood, the ships moved, the missions succeeded, the sailors came home because I led. That was my legacy, not his. When I went back inside that night, the medal case sat on my desk next to the folded flag from my last change of command. I ran my fingers across the stars on my collar and realized something simple but sharp. His silence didn't hurt anymore. It just didn't matter. I had outgrown it. I had outlived it, and it had no power left. Coming back to Virginia Beach felt like opening a door to a room that had never changed while everything inside me had. The streets looked the same. The porch light flickered the way it always did, and the house still smelled faintly of aftershave polished wood and something stale beneath it all. I arrived 2 days before Evan's SEAL ceremony because the family invitation had come not from Douglas, but from Evan himself. He had called me weeks before, voice quiet, almost formal. It would mean a lot if you came, Sloan. He hadn't said it, but I heard what he didn't want to. Dad would never ask. I told him I'd be there. Not for Douglas, not for Linda. For him. When I stepped through the front door in my civilian blazer, they were waiting in the living room. Douglas leaned back in his chair like a man who owned the world. Linda perched on the couch beside him with that tight smile she wore like armor. Evan stood near the doorway to the kitchen, tall now, built from training and ambition, still carrying that careful way of existing around his father. The room fell quiet for half a second before Douglas gave me the same smirk I'd seen my whole life. Well, look who decided to show up. The paper pusher herself. Linda chuckled like she always did when she didn't want to make things worse. but never wanted to make them better either. I could have said something. 30 years of rank sat behind my name. I'd commanded fleets, spoken with heads of state, walked battle decks where decisions shaped history. But in this house, none of that meant anything. Douglas didn't see Vice Admiral Archer. He saw the extra at the end of the table. So I smiled politely, hung my coat on the rack, and let him believe his words still had weight. Because in a few days, in front of hundreds of people, the world would remind him otherwise. Dinner that night was everything I expected it to be. Linda made pot roast just like she had when I was a teenager. The table was set the same way it always was. Douglas at the head, Evan on his right, Linda on his left, me at the far end. Some patterns never die. Douglas carved the roast with the ceremonial precision of a king and spent the first 10 minutes asking Evan questions about the ceremony, about training, about the Trident. He was so proud he nearly glowed. Then he turned his gaze on me like a hunter finding an easy mark. "I suppose logistics is still keeping you busy," he said. "Someone's got to move the boxes around, right?" Linda laughed again, soft, brittle, and Evan's eyes flickered toward me for just a second. I kept my voice even. "I'm still serving." That was all I said. He waved his hand like he was shooing a fly. "Real Navy," he muttered. I set my fork down carefully and looked at my plate. I had faced hostile foreign commanders with more respect than he had ever shown me at this table. Evan shifted uncomfortably. His shoulders had the weight of someone caught between loyalty and shame. I could see it. He had grown up watching the same theater I had endured. The difference was he had always been on the stage. I had been in the shadows. The conversation swirled around him after that. Stories about his training, his classmates, the pride Douglas felt. Linda kept nodding like a spectator at a show she'd already seen 100 times. I listened in silence, sipping water, watching the steam rise from the pot roast like smoke from something slowly burning. If this had been 20 years ago, his words would have sunk into my skin like barbs. Now they barely grazed the surface. Years of deployments and command had taught me the value of choosing when to fight. This was not the battlefield, not yet. When dinner ended, Douglas leaned back, patted his stomach, and said to Evan loud enough for me to hear, "It's a good thing one of us made something real of himself." Evan opened his mouth, but no words came out. His silence was its own confession. I collected the plates, and began clearing the table. Linda blinked, surprised, because she'd always expected me to either bristle or retreat, but I did neither. I simply moved with quiet efficiency, stacking silverware. Wiping down the table, moving like I had on the decks of a ship, measured deliberate, unshaken. Douglas watched me as if trying to figure out why the old script wasn't working anymore. Maybe he saw it in my posture. Maybe he felt it in the air, the absence of that invisible weight I used to carry. Whatever it was, he didn't say another word. Linda began to fuss in the kitchen, trying to bridge the silence. Evan followed me as I carried dishes to the sink. "Sloan," he whispered. "I'm sorry." I glanced at him and said quietly, "You have nothing to be sorry for." He lowered his eyes, and for the first time I saw the boy who had grown up adored and still understood what it meant to be small beneath Douglas's shadow. Later that night, lying in the small guest room they'd barely touched in years, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the muted sound of the house settling. I could hear Douglas's voice in the distance, the same rhythm of mumbled bragging and laughter. It didn't sting the way it used to. It was just noise. I thought of the ceremony ahead of the uniforms, the crowd, the Admiral who would be on stage. He didn't know it yet, but the same man who spent years calling me a paper pusher was about to watch an entire community stand in respect to the name he mocked. I didn't come here to humiliate him. I came because Evan asked. But life has a way of revealing truths without you having to force them. Tomorrow would be about Evan, but the day after would belong to the truth. A truth that had been waiting decades to step into the light. I turned on my side, pulled the thin blanket tighter, and let the sound of the house fade away. I didn't need to win an argument at that dinner table. I had already won the war years ago. All that was left was the silence before the storm. The morning of the ceremony broke with the kind of sharp sunlight only California seems to have, the kind that cuts through everything and leaves no place to hide. Coronado was already alive before dawn, families in suits and dresses walking toward the Naval Amphibious base, flags fluttering against a clean sky, a low hum of anticipation running through the crowd like a current. I walked through the gate with my cover tucked neatly under my arm, wearing my service dress blues. The weight of my stars sat on my collar, subtle but unmistakable. I'd worn this uniform in war rooms and command centers across the world. But today was different. Today, I walked into a place where my stepfather believed I was nothing more than a paper pusher. The stands were already filling when I arrived. Rows of families and friends, proud faces, tears barely held back the kind of pride that comes from watching someone survive something most never will. Buds breaks people. Earning the Trident is a crucible. I respected every single person standing in formation on that parade deck, including Evan. He had earned this. That much was true. I spotted Douglas and Linda almost immediately. He stood near the middle section wearing a pressed polo shirt that strained a little at the collar, sunglasses perched on his nose like he was trying too hard to look important. Linda had on one of her careful dresses, the kind she used to wear to church, clutching a small purse to her chest. They were talking animatedly to a cluster of other parents. Douglas's laugh carried just far enough for me to hear it. That familiar, self-satisfied rumble. He was bragging, of course. His son, the SEAL. His legacy. The man who would carry the Whitlock name forward. I stayed back, leaning against one of the support rails at the edge of the seating area, half in shadow. It didn't surprise me that he hadn't even noticed me arrive. He had spent his whole life not noticing me. I watched as he gestured broadly toward Evan in formation, no doubt telling anyone who would listen how proud he was, how much work his son had put in. The irony of it almost made me smile. He had no idea what was about to happen. The ceremony began with precision. The Navy band played each note clean as glass. The colors were presented, the flag catching the morning light in a way that made even the most stoic faces soften. Officers and instructors moved with practiced rhythm, their voices crisp, their steps sharp against the concrete. Every detail was controlled. This was the Navy's house, and we knew how to run a ceremony. Families clapped as names were called one by one as the men in uniform stepped forward to receive their pins to accept the small piece of gold that meant so much more than its weight. When Evan's name was called, Douglas's cheer rose above the crowd, unrestrained and loud, like a man announcing his own victory. Evan stepped forward, straight back, serious, every inch the operator he had trained to become. I felt something in my chest tighten. Not anger, not even bitterness, just memory. The years of sitting at that same table being told he was the legacy. Then the guest speaker approached the podium. A 3-star general. He was a tall, solid man with the kind of posture you only get after decades in uniform. I'd worked with him before years ago in the Pacific. I knew him. More importantly, he knew me. His speech began as expected, a tribute to the grueling path these young men had endured, the brothers lost along the way, the history they were stepping into. His voice carried across the stands a mix of weight and quiet pride. And then it happened. Mid-sentence, his gaze swept the audience, casual at first, until it landed on me. Recognition flickered in his eyes. He paused, just for a breath. But it was enough to pull the entire crowd into that silence with him. His shoulders squared, his jaw tightened slightly, and without another word, he stepped away from the podium. Every officer on that deck stiffened. Every sailor noticed. He walked down the steps slowly, deliberately, each footfall echoing louder than the music had moments before. The crowd began to murmur. Evan's head turned in confusion. Douglas frowned, shifting his weight. The general cut across the front row, his eyes locked on me, and when he stopped 2 steps in front of where I stood, he did something Douglas could never have imagined in his entire life. He came to attention, lifted his hand to his brow, and saluted me. The sound of movement rippled across the deck. Sailors stiffened. Officers followed. It was muscle memory, tradition, respect. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. "Vice Admiral Sloan Archer," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the parade deck. "Pacific Fleet Logistics Command. It's an honor, ma'am." For a moment, everything froze. Every eye in that crowd turned. Evans included. The young men in formation pivoted slightly instinctively as if gravity itself had shifted. Douglas's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Linda's purse slipped from her hand and hit the bleacher floor with a dull thud. The general's salute was crisp, unwavering, and in that instant, the narrative that had ruled my family for decades cracked wide open. I returned the salute slowly, deliberately. It wasn't about theatrics. It was about truth. For 30 years, he had mocked me, diminished me, dismissed me. Now, the institution he worshipped, the one he used as a weapon to belittle me, had just placed me higher than he could ever imagine. Not because I wanted his validation, because I'd earned it. Brick by brick, year by year. The general stepped back, nodded once, and turned toward the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice ringing with formal clarity, "it seems we have a distinguished guest among us today, Vice Admiral Archer, one of the finest logistical commanders the Pacific Fleet has ever had the privilege to serve with." The applause started small. A few claps here and there from officers who recognized the name. Then it spread. Like a wave. Louder. Stronger. The sound filled the air and rolled over the bleachers. Evans straightened unconsciously as every SEAL in training does when rank enters the space. Even the instructors glanced toward me with quiet respect. Douglas stood in the middle of it all like a man who had just watched the world tilt on its axis. His face was pale, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the bleacher railing. For a man who loved control, this was the one moment he could not control anything. The applause wasn't for Evan. It wasn't for him. It was for the woman he'd spent his life pretending didn't matter. I could see the calculation flicker in his eyes, the way he struggled to understand what had just happened. The daughter he mocked was not a paper pusher. She was the one a 3-star general saluted in front of hundreds of people. He had spent a lifetime building a hierarchy in his head, and in a single breath, reality had torn it down. Evan's reaction was quieter. He stared at me from formation, his eyes-wide confusion melting into something else. Pride. Respect. Maybe even guilt. He had grown up under the weight of the story Douglas had written. But stories crack when truth walks into the room wearing stars on her collar. The general returned to the podium, resumed his speech without missing a beat, but the energy of the ceremony had changed completely. I didn't need to say a single word. The salute had spoken louder than anything I could ever tell them. When the ceremony ended, families rushed toward the newly pinned SEALs, hugs and photographs and congratulations filling the air like confetti. I didn't rush. I stood where I was, letting the sunlight rest on my shoulders, watching the crowd. Douglas approached slowly, like someone walking through a fog he couldn't clear. Linda trailed behind him, her hands nervously twisting the strap of her purse. Evan reached me first. He still had the trident gleaming on his chest, sweat at his temples, eyes searching mine. "You never said," he breathed. "You never asked," I replied. He gave a short, shaky laugh. "Vice Admiral." His voice caught on the words, half awe, half realization. I placed a hand on his shoulder and squeezed. He had earned his moment. I wasn't here to take it from him. Douglas finally came close enough for me to see the full collapse in his face. He looked smaller than I remembered. Sloan. He started, but the name sounded strange in his mouth, like something foreign. I didn't give him an answer. I didn't need to. The silence between us had grown too old to fill with anything else. Linda offered a weak, trembling smile. We didn't know she whispered. I met her eyes, steady and calm. "You never wanted to." Behind us, the crowd still clapped for other families, cameras flashing, voices rising. The Navy band played something triumphant, but in the small, brittle silence between me and the people who had spent their lives erasing me, everything that needed to be said had already been spoken with one salute. Would you forgive them at this moment or let the silence speak? Comment below. The crowd thinned slowly after the ceremony, families peeling off in every direction with bouquets, camera flashes, and the kind of laughter that sticks in the air like sunlight. The bleachers had emptied, but their echoes remained a dull hum in the background that made the quiet in the parking lot sharper. I walked alone through the rows of cars, the sound of my heels steady against the pavement, the sun slanting lower in the sky. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't the one trying to shrink myself smaller to fit their comfort. I could feel it in the way people had looked at me after the salute, the way even strangers straightened their spines when I passed. They knew what that salute meant. So did Douglas. I had just reached my car when I heard the shuffle of footsteps behind me. I didn't turn around immediately. I knew that sound, the hesitation in it, the weight of someone trying to rewrite a story too late. When I finally turned, Douglas and Linda stood a few feet away, both looking as if the ground beneath them had shifted and they weren't sure how to stand anymore. Douglas had taken off his sunglasses, which almost never happened. His face was pale in the soft light. He opened his mouth, but for a second, nothing came out. Linda clutched the strap of her purse like it might steady her. Sloane Douglas said finally, "My name, not girl." Not any of the little cutting words he used when he wanted to make me smaller. Just Sloane. And it landed between us like something fragile and heavy at the same time. I raised an eyebrow slightly. "That's new." He flinched. Not visibly, not like a man struck, but just enough that I saw the flicker of it. He glanced at Linda as if she might step in for him the way she always had, but she didn't. She just stared at me like someone seeing a person she'd known her whole life for the first time. I didn't know, Douglas said, voice low, almost hoarse. "I didn't know what you'd become." I let out a small, controlled breath through my nose. "You didn't ask," I said evenly. "For 30 years. That stopped him. His mouth opened again, but nothing followed. He wasn't used to me answering like this. He was used to the girl at the end of the table who lowered her eyes and swallowed her words. That girl had died somewhere between Norfolk and Bahrain, between late nights on steel decks and quiet promotions with no one to applaud. Linda stepped forward first, her voice small. "We're sorry," she said. "We should have—" She broke off, looking at Douglas again and then at the pavement. "We should have seen you." I tilted my head. "You saw me," I said. "You just didn't want to look too closely. It was easier to pretend I didn't exist than to accept what didn't fit your story." The silence that followed wasn't the kind that holds hope. It was the kind that marks the first crack in something that can't be repaired. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. My stars had spoken for me earlier. This moment was just a quiet reckoning. Douglas took a step closer, and for the first time in my life, his voice didn't carry weight. It trembled. "I thought—" He started and then shook his head like someone trying to make sense of a language they couldn't speak. "I thought you were just going to work in some office. I didn't know you were a Vice Admiral," I finished for him. His jaw clenched. "Yeah?" I stared at him, steady, unblinking. "It didn't matter what I became. It never would have been enough for you. Not back then." That was the truth laid bare in the middle of an asphalt parking lot, with the late afternoon sun turning everything gold around us. The man who had spent decades mocking me was now standing in front of me, stripped of the only power he ever had, the illusion that his approval meant anything. Evan appeared then, jogging across the lot, still half in uniform, the trident gleaming against his chest. His hair stuck slightly to his forehead, his cheeks flushed with the adrenaline of the day. But his eyes weren't celebratory. They were searching. Nervous. He slowed as he reached us, taking in the sight of Douglas and Linda, standing stiffly. Me, standing calm and quiet. "Sloane," he said, almost a question. I turned to him, and before I could say a word, he stepped forward and pulled me into a hug. It wasn't the awkward, distant hug of years past. It was tight, real, like something had cracked open in him, too. His voice was low against my shoulder. "I'm sorry. I should have said something all those years. I should have stood up for you." I saw what he said. I saw what he did. I didn't do anything. I closed my eyes for a second, letting the weight of his apology settle without letting it drown me. "You were a kid, Evan," I said. "And then, you were a man trying to survive in his world. I don't need your guilt." He pulled back just enough to look at me. His eyes were wet at the edges but steady. "I do." I placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then make it count now." Behind him, Douglas and Linda stood silently, like people watching a scene they were no longer the center of. Douglas's shoulders sagged slightly, the first sign of defeat I'd ever seen on him. Not the theatrical kind, the quiet, sinking kind that comes when a man finally understands that the story he wrote in his head doesn't exist anymore. Linda whispered. "We didn't mean to." "Yes, you did," I said softly. "You meant to look past me. You meant to make him the center, and I accepted that for a long time. But not anymore." Evan exhaled sharply like a man finally letting go of a weight he didn't know he'd been carrying. "You deserved more than what we gave you." I nodded. "I know, but I stopped needing it a long time ago." Douglas's gaze dropped to the pavement. For a man who had spent decades commanding every room in that house, he looked small now. He wasn't facing an argument he could win. He was facing the truth, and truth doesn't negotiate. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said quietly. "Good," I replied, "because I'm not offering it. Not today." The silence stretched between us long and cold and strangely clean. For once, I didn't feel the ache that used to live under my ribs whenever he said my name. I didn't feel the child waiting for him to change. I felt exactly who I had become, a woman who had built her own name without needing his. Evan reached for my hand, then a small, steady gesture that reminded me not all of the past was irreparable. I squeezed back once. He would build his own way forward, separate from Douglas's shadow, and that was enough. As I turned toward my car, the breeze shifted, carrying the faint sound of distant waves. Behind me, Douglas didn't call out. Linda didn't follow. The world they'd built around their own version of the truth had cracked. Not loudly, not with fury, with silence. A silence that had finally changed sides. For 30 years, they called me girl. Now they called me Sloane. And even that came too late to matter. The walls of my quarters at Pearl Harbor had always been plain. Navy white sharp corners, a desk that had seen too many late nights, and a single window that looked out toward the water where the lights from the ships scattered across the bay like broken stars. It was quiet here at night, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask for anything, and maybe that's why the past always found its way back in those hours. The day after the ceremony, after the salute that cracked something open in everyone but me, I sat at that desk with the lamp on low and let the silence breathe. It was a familiar kind of silence, the kind that reminded me of all the moments they never saw. I thought of the first real medal that had meant something to me, the bronze star pinned to my uniform after a logistics operation in the Persian Gulf that most people will never read about. It wasn't a glamorous mission. No one writes about convoys rerouted under pressure, about fuel lines held together in a sandstorm, about moving supplies through contested waters. But the mission had kept a task force operational. It had mattered. When the medal touched the fabric of my uniform, when the applause filled the small room, I had looked around and realized not one familiar face was there. I hadn't even told them. Why would I? Back then, I still remembered the way Douglas had looked at me when I first joined. I had stopped asking for his attention years before. That night after the ceremony, I called home anyway. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was some small piece of me still reaching out, even though I swore I wouldn't. He answered the phone with the same flat voice he always used when it wasn't about Evan. I told him I'd been awarded the Bronze Star. There was a pause, a long one, the kind that doesn't mean someone is absorbing the weight of your words. It means they're deciding how little to give you. "Good for you," he said finally, then told me the score of Evan's football game before hanging up. I remember the dial tone more than anything else. I remember how loud it sounded in the dark. Years later, when I made captain, I didn't call. When I made Rear Admiral, the news ran its own course like everything in the Navy eventually does. Promotions of that level get noticed. Evan sent a short message. "Proud of you, sis." Douglas sent one too. 3 words. "Good for you." No punctuation, no warmth. Just a message stripped down to something that could have been sent to a stranger. I stared at it on my phone for a long time, not because it hurt in the way it once might have, but because it reminded me that some people will never see beyond the story they wrote for you. To him, I was still the girl at the table who wasn't supposed to matter. I didn't reply to that message. I tucked the phone away and went back to the briefing I'd been preparing. That's what I did with pain then. I folded it down until it became neat and quiet, then I stored it where it couldn't touch anything else. But the truth is, it did touch things. The quietness bled into the way I lived. It was in the way I walked through command centers with an expression people called calm, but was really armor. It was in the way I accepted praise without reaching for it, in the way I learned to trust the structure of the Navy more than the softness of people. It was in the way my smile always came second after the room was already safe. When you spend your entire life being unseen, you learn to make your own sight sharp enough to pierce anything. I built my career on precision control and the refusal to need applause. The Navy gave me a language Douglas never bothered to learn. Mission, execution, command, rank. Things that didn't need anyone's approval to be real. But beneath all of it, the wound didn't fade. It just changed shape. It became something quieter, something cold and steady. I learned to keep my voice even when I wanted to scream. I learned to return insults with silence because silence was more permanent than rage. Rage burns out. Silence stays. When I made Vice Admiral, they held a formal ceremony in Washington. Cameras, senior leadership, flags, speeches, a lifetime of service tied up in a few sentences. I stood there in my uniform, stars gleaming hands still, and accepted the promotion with a salute. Afterward, while everyone else was celebrating, I found a moment alone in a corner of the hallway. I pulled out my phone, not because I expected anything different, but because some pieces of habit are hard to kill. There it was again. A message from Douglas. Good for you. That was the moment something inside me finally went quiet in a way it never had before. There wasn't anger left. There wasn't disappointment. Just clarity. This was who he was. This was what he would always give. And the space where his recognition should have been became a hollow I filled with discipline and purpose. The Navy taught me how to lead, how to command, how to hold entire operations together. But it was his neglect that taught me how to survive in the silence between recognition and reality. Every mission, every medal, every step forward, I carried that cold steadiness with me. Some people get fuel from applause. I got mine from the void, but that void has teeth. It makes you sharp, but it also makes you distant. People used to tell me I was composed, that I carried myself like someone nothing could touch. They were right and wrong at the same time. Nothing could touch me because I had already learned that everything can. It's just a matter of whether you let it. I remember the Bronze Star in a quiet room, no family in sight. I remember the Rear Admiral promotion, the text message that read like a shrug. I remember birthdays where my phone never rang, holidays where I stayed on base because the idea of sitting through another dinner at that table was worse than the quiet of the barracks. I remember all the little cuts that built the person they saw standing in Coronado when the general saluted. People think strength is born out of victories. Mine was built out of being unseen and unacknowledged for so long that the only way forward was to become someone they could no longer ignore. Not for their sake, for mine. That night at Pearl Harbor, I closed my laptop, leaned back in my chair, and stared at the faint shimmer of lights on the water. The ache was still there, but it didn't own me. It was just part of the landscape now, like the faint hum of the base at night, like the low wind that moved across the bay. I had built an entire life around being strong enough to never need his voice. And now, after all these years, the world had finally heard mine without him in it. It was a Tuesday morning when my aide stepped into my office at Pearl Harbor and said, "Ma'am, there's a civilian couple in the lobby asking to see you. They said their names are Douglas and Linda Whitlock." For a brief second, the air in the room seemed to still. It had been months since the ceremony at Coronado. Months since the salute that shattered a story they had built for decades. I hadn't heard a word from either of them since that day, and that silence had felt clean earned. But now here they were, halfway across the Pacific, standing at the front desk of a naval installation where access isn't easy. If they were here, it wasn't for reconciliation. People like Douglas didn't travel thousands of miles for something intangible like an apology. They came when they wanted something. "Escort them in," I said. My voice was even practiced, the same tone I used with admirals and foreign ministers. It's a tone that doesn't give anything away. They walked in 10 minutes later. Douglas moved slower than I remembered, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes carrying the brittle look of someone who'd been chipped away by something bigger than his ego. Linda hovered just behind him, hands clasped like she was trying to keep herself together. They didn't look like the people who had sat on those bleachers in California full of smug pride. They looked like people who had lost something they didn't know how to name. He stopped just in front of my desk, eyes flicking up to the brass nameplate. Vice Admiral Sloan Archer. It's funny how words look different once you're forced to read them with new eyes. He cleared his throat a sound too small for the room. Sloan, he said. It was still strange hearing my name from his mouth, no longer weighed down by contempt, but by something else. Need. I didn't offer him a seat. I let the silence stretch the kind that makes people reveal themselves. Linda shifted her weight. Douglas stared at the floor. Finally, he said I wouldn't be here if it wasn't serious. I folded my hands on the desk. Then, get to it. His mouth twitched at my tone, as if some old reflex wanted to rise the part of him that had spent a lifetime believing he could diminish me with a single look. But it wasn't there anymore. He was standing in a command office that wasn't his on a base that wasn't his, facing a woman whose world existed far beyond the boundaries of his control. I lost my job, he said finally, a few months back. Linda's retirement covers some things, but there are medical bills. Insurance isn't covering everything. He hesitated, then his pride crumbling in real time. We need help. There it was, not an apology, not a recognition. A need, a plea wrapped in the language of desperation. I tilted my head slightly, studying him. Help from me. His throat moved as he swallowed. You've got connections, he said carefully. You could make some calls. I know how these things work. A job or something with the Navy. Or maybe help with the hospital costs. Just something. Linda finally found her voice. We wouldn't ask if it wasn't serious, she said quickly. It's been hard. We thought maybe. Her voice trailed off. I let the silence sit between us like a weight. This was the same man who called me a paper pusher for 30 years, who never came to a single ceremony, who reduced every achievement to a joke. This was the man who didn't know about the Bronze Star, who dismissed my rank when he didn't understand it, who only saw me when a general saluted me in front of hundreds of people. And now he was standing in front of my desk asking for help because the world had finally stopped giving him everything by default. I leaned back slightly in my chair. You're asking me to use my position to get you favors. Douglas winced at the way I said it. I just thought, you thought that after 30 years of pretending I didn't matter, I'd drop everything to save you. I said calmly. You thought the person you called girl would forget everything the moment you needed something. He lifted his head, and I saw it something raw and ugly flashing across his face. Not anger this time. Shame. I was wrong, he said quietly. I nodded. Yes, you were. Linda took a step forward. Please, Sloan. We're not asking for much. Just a door, an introduction, a lifeline. You can do things we can't. For a moment, I watched them, really watched them. Not the towering, smug man who had once defined my childhood, not the silent accomplice who smiled while he mocked me. Just two people standing in front of me because the balance of power had shifted so far they couldn't pretend otherwise anymore. I spent my entire life listening to you remind me I wasn't enough, I said softly. You made sure I knew my place at that table. And now, years later, you've walked into my world asking me to open doors for you. Douglas's breath hitched. I know, he said. I know what I did. I can't take it back. No, I said. You can't. He reached for the edge of my desk as if steadying himself. Sloan, I'm not asking as your father. I know I never was. I'm asking as a man who needs help. There was something almost tragic in the way he said it. But tragedy doesn't erase a lifetime. It doesn't clean the slate. It only shows what people become when their power is gone. I straightened in my chair. My voice didn't rise. It didn't harden. It stayed steady, cold, and procedural. Douglas, I can't use my position to secure employment or manipulate systems for personal connections. And even if I could, I wouldn't. There are channels for medical assistance. There are veteran programs. There are state services. But me, I let the word hang. I'm not your legacy. Evan is. Remember? It was like I'd thrown something invisible but sharp across the room. His face cracked just slightly, the way stone does when it meets pressure. He blinked, his jaw trembling, his hands tightening against the wood of my desk. Linda's breath caught. He whispered, "Please." Just that one word. The man who never lowered his voice for anyone now said it like it was costing him something he didn't know how to give. I stood then smoothing my uniform coat as I stepped around the desk. The movement made him flinch slightly, as if the sight of me in this space, this power, reminded him of just how far away from me he really was now. "You spent 30 years pretending I wasn't worth respect," I said quietly. "And the truth is, I stopped needing yours a long time ago. So, no, Douglas. I'm not going to save you. Not this time. Not ever." He lowered his head. It was the first time I had ever seen him look small, not angry, not dismissive, just small. Linda reached out almost instinctively but stopped short of touching me. "We have nowhere else to go," she whispered. "Then you'll have to find another way," I said. The air in the room felt colder then. He stumbled slightly as he turned toward the door, his shoulders shaking. Linda followed silent except for the sound of her shoes against the floor. I didn't stop them. I didn't offer comfort. I didn't even look away. I let them walk out of my world the same way they had spent decades walking past me. When the door closed, the office was quiet again. The base hummed faintly in the distance. Ships moved on the horizon, convoys launched planes lifted off the runway. My world kept spinning steady and intact. Theirs had finally cracked. I walked to the window and watched the Pacific stretching wide and endless. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel revenge like fire. I felt the cold, clean edge of consequence. This was what it looked like when a story built on cruelty finally met reality. No more power, no more control, just the aftermath. Some people think revenge is loud. Mine was silence, a silence they couldn't escape anymore. The October air in Arlington carried a kind of quiet that only comes with fall crisp and clean, carrying the faint rustle of leaves down long ceremonial walkways. The sun was low enough to cast a golden light across the manicured lawns, catching the edges of white chairs set out for the evening ceremony. A row of flags snapped softly in the breeze, each movement measured like the Navy itself breathing in rhythm. I stood at the edge of the stage before stepping up to the podium, my uniform immaculate, my ribbons a record of decades, my stars steady on my collar. It had been 30 years since I walked into the academy gates alone. 30 years of service deployments, commands, storms, victories no one clapped for but me. Rows of officers, sailors, friends, and colleagues filled the seats in front of me, faces from every corner of my career. The gruff old captain from my first ship in Norfolk, younger officers I'd mentored in Bahrain, logisticians who had kept the fleet alive in the South China Sea Senior Command, who had stood beside me in rooms where the world shifted inch by inch. They were all here. And in the third row, next to a cluster of officers, sat Evan. He wasn't wearing dress blues today, just a simple dark suit, his posture easy, but his eyes steady on me. No Douglas. No Linda. Just Evan. When the master of ceremonies finished reading my service record, there was a moment of applause that rolled through the crowd like a soft wave. It wasn't the kind of applause that comes from spectacle. It came from people who understood exactly what those 3 decades meant. Not the headlines, the grind, the nights, the sacrifices that don't make noise. I stepped up to the podium and adjusted the microphone, not because it needed it, but because it gave me a second to breathe. I looked out over the faces. Some young, some weathered, all part of the long line of people who had carried the Navy forward. For so many years, I had measured myself against a voice that told me I wasn't enough. But in this moment, there was no voice, just the quiet certainty of what I'd built. When I joined the Navy, I began my voice carrying across the lawn. I didn't have anyone in the stands. I didn't have someone waving or cheering or calling my name. I had a duffel bag, a pair of boots that didn't quite fit, and a decision I never regretted. A small ripple of laughter came from a few of the older sailors. They understood. I learned early that this job isn't about being seen, I continued. It's about showing up. It's about the nights no one remembers and the missions no one talks about. It's about the people who do the work quietly so others can do theirs loudly. It's about every sailor who stood a midnight watch and kept the lights on. I paused, letting the words settle. For years, I thought I needed to prove something to people who would never bother to look. And somewhere along the way, I stopped trying. I started building, and the Navy became home. I scanned the crowd, and my gaze landed on Evan. He didn't look away. His expression carried a quiet pride, unforced real. It wasn't the kind of pride Douglas had wielded like a weapon. It was the kind of pride that comes from understanding, from respect earned and finally recognized. I don't believe in legacies that belong to one person, I said. I believe in the legacy of the work, the ships that sail, the sailors who return home, the quiet victories no one else will ever read about. That's the only kind of legacy worth leaving. The applause came again louder this time, not because the words were grand, but because they were true. I had spent a lifetime commanding fleets, but this was the first time I spoke without the weight of needing to be heard by people who never wanted to listen. When the ceremony ended, officers lined up to shake my hand, to offer their words, to tell their stories of operations and deployments and long nights. I smiled at each of them, not out of formality, but because every handshake was a thread in a tapestry I had built without anyone's permission. Evan waited until the line had thinned. When he finally stepped forward, he didn't say much. He just pulled me into a hug strong and steady. No apologies this time. No wait. Just respect. "Congratulations, Admiral," he said quietly, and this time the word didn't feel foreign coming from him. "Thank you," I replied. He stepped back and looked at me with a soft grin. "Douglas isn't here," he said after a beat. I know, I answered. He doesn't need to be. And that was the truth. For so long I had carried the ghost of what he never gave me. But standing there under the fading light of Arlington, surrounded by the people who mattered, the silence of his absence didn't feel like a wound. It felt like space. Clean, quiet space I could finally fill with something else. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the last of the officers headed out, their laughter trailing behind them. Evan walked beside me toward the edge of the field. No crowd, no speeches. Just the sound of our footsteps against the path. For the first time in my life, I didn't need to be acknowledged to know my worth. I had built something lasting not out of their approval, but out of my own will. And in that quiet, I felt something I had never felt before. Not victory, not vengeance. Peace. My peace. On my terms. The night air at Pearl Harbor was still warm even in October. The wind carried the soft, rhythmic sound of water slapping against the pier, and the massive shape of the carrier resting in the harbor was outlined by quiet rows of yellow lights. It wasn't loud the way it was during deployments. There was no hum of engines, no echoing commands bouncing off the decks. Just stillness. Ships have a way of sleeping, and tonight the whole harbor seemed to be holding its breath. I walked down to the edge of the pier with my jacket folded over my arm, still wearing the uniform from the ceremony earlier. The medals were gone, the crowd was gone. The applause had long faded, but the feeling in my chest was something new. Not fire, not the iron-edged resolve that had carried me through most of my life. Something softer, quieter. It was peace, though it took me a second to recognize it for what it was. I stopped near the end of the pier, where the lights stretched far enough to touch the edge of the water, but not enough to reach the dark horizon. In the distance, the faint outline of other ships seemed to breathe. I rested both hands on the cool railing, feeling the metal steady beneath my palms. For so many years, the Navy had been my anchor, my weapon, and my shield. Tonight, it simply felt like home. The harbor always held the sound of memory. I had walked these piers as a young officer with sharp edges and more ambition than rank. I had walked them years later, carrying the weight of responsibility across entire fleets. And now I walked them as a Vice Admiral, nearing the twilight of a career built on silence turned into power. So many of my nights had ended like this, alone, watching the ships, listening to the water, letting the world quiet itself before tomorrow began again. My phone buzzed once in my pocket. A single message. I pulled it out and saw Evan's name on the screen. "I'm proud of you, sis. Always should have been." The words were simple. They didn't carry the forced weight of apology or the elaborate wrapping of guilt. They were exactly what they were supposed to be: honest, late, but real. I stared at them for a moment, feeling a small knot in my chest loosen, the kind that had been sitting there for decades without me realizing how heavy it had become. I didn't need that message, not anymore, but it meant something all the same. Not because it filled a void, but because it wasn't tied to Douglas's voice. It was Evans alone, a grown man stepping out of his father's shadow, seeing me fully for the first time. I typed nothing in return. I didn't need to. I slid the phone back into my pocket and let the silence settle again. The water reflected the shiplights like shards of gold scattered across the surface. The breeze brushed my hair back cool and steady. When I was a girl at that dinner table, I thought the only way to survive was to be quiet enough not to be a target. Later, I thought the only way to be seen was to earn it so loudly the world couldn't look away. But somewhere along the years, something shifted. I learned that the real power wasn't in being louder. It was in no longer needing to be heard by people who refused to listen. I thought of Douglas. I thought of the way he used to smirk when he called me a paper pusher, of the way Linda laughed like a background character in a story she didn't want to disrupt. I thought of how small his voice had sounded in my office months ago, stripped of everything it once had. And I truly realized, that nothing he said could ever matter again. He hadn't taken anything from me. He had just delayed the moment I finally claimed what was mine. The Navy had given me everything he wouldn't: discipline, direction, a voice that didn't need his permission to exist. But what made it real wasn't the rank or the medals. It was this moment standing alone at the pier, feeling no need to prove anything to anyone. The stars overhead were faint against the city lights, but they were still there, just like they had been the night I signed that academy application alone, just like they had been the night I stood on a deck in Bahrain, the night the general saluted me, the night I told Douglas no. They were constant, quiet, unbothered by who believed in them. A faint sound of laughter carried across the water from a group of junior sailors walking down the path behind me. It was warm, easy, alive. It reminded me of myself when I still believed that approval came from outside. It made me smile, not with nostalgia, but with recognition. I had made it through the storm. I rested my elbows on the railing, leaning slightly forward, the reflection of the lights rippling beneath me. I didn't need their validation, I whispered to myself, the words soft enough to disappear into the wind. I just needed my voice back. That was the truth that had been waiting for me at the end of all of this. It had never really been about revenge. It had been about reclamation, taking back the narrative he'd tried to write over me, reclaiming my worth without asking for permission. Somewhere behind me, the night carried on. Base operations continued. Ships waited. Planes slept. The world moved as it always had, but inside me everything was finally still. If your family ever doubted your worth, would you fight back or walk away? Tell me below.